Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Practical Permaculture podcast. I am your host, Alysse. I'm still feeling under the weather. Whatever this was has really knocked me around. I ended up losing my voice for 4 days. I was in bed and I've just been feeling horrible, like struggling to breathe, the whole head cold kind of situation. So I will keep this intro short again this week just to save my voice. It has started to get wintry here in the northern rivers. I had a few days of beautiful sun, but it was still crisp. I went outside and I've been sowing a lot of my spring seeds. I know it sounds early, but we don't get frosts here and our winters are very mild. So when I say cold days, it's not as cold as you're probably thinking. So I've planted out some basil, some tomatoes. I've planted some more nasturtium and some borage. So also sowed some pumpkin seeds because they have overwintered essentially in my garden. I just left them and they're still flowering and producing pumpkins. They're getting eaten by possums or whatever, but they're still there and they're surviving, as are the tomatoes. So that's why I decided to go ahead and plant those seeds because they're already happening and thriving in the garden. So I assumed they'd be fine, even if they are a little bit slow. And then in August, I'll plant my cucumbers and my zucchini. I'm going to trial tromboncino this year too because we get powdery mildew and I had a very poor harvest of zucchini last year. And someone told me that in the subtropics, tromboncino are a good alternative to growing traditional zucchinis. I will plant some normal zucchini seeds though too because we might get an early harvest of those and then rely on the tromboncinos in late summer. So that's what's happening in my garden at the moment. It's been nice to get out there and be in the garden, tidy things up, see what needs doing. We need to get a load of soil in to plant all of our bare-rooted fruit trees before spring hits, but our driveway is currently inaccessible because of the build. So we're waiting for the build to get a bit further along before we can do that. And hopefully we don't leave it too late. This week's podcast is with Anna Matilda, the urban Nanna. She has just released a book called Everyday Permaculture. I chatted with her a good month or so ago now, but we had the most amazing chat. She is the most epic human. She's so interesting. Her book is so practical and, as the title suggests, every day. It's for anybody, whether you're living in an apartment or on a homestead. It's just got so many things in there that are easy to do and that you can do them straight away. You don't need all this knowledge or resources. It's just awesome. I think it's the gap in the market that we've needed for a long time for permaculture. We have all these amazing people doing amazing things, but this entry-level permaculture, I think, is so needed. So big thanks to Anna for releasing a book that does that. There's chapters on foraging, there's recipes, homesteading, craft skills, all kinds of stuff. So get your hands on it. It's definitely worth buying. Quick word from our sponsor, and then I will get straight into the episode. Our gardens and bodies are made up of water, but did you know what is in yours? If you're like me, you're probably thinking that it's time to check the tank. And on top of that, there's modern contamination of PFAS, chlorine, and other chemicals that are linked to real health impacts. Aussie-based mywaterscore.com.au has made it possible to get real lab results from NATA certified labs straight from your mailbox. Whether you're on tank, bore, or mains, it's a simple mail to lab kit that gives you clear results for bacteria, PFAS, heavy metals, and more. It's all explained in plain English. Use the code PRACTICAL to get a discount off your first test at mywaterscore.com.au. Welcome to the Practical Permaculture Podcast, your weekly dose of gardening, intentional living, and all things permaculture, served with a side of fun and plenty of great conversations. I'm your host, Alysse, and together we'll dig into practical tips, chat with experts, and explore ways to cultivate a more abundant, sustainable life. Let's get growing! Hello, Anna. How are you?
I'm all right. How are you?
Good, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So, for people who don't know who you are, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your context?
Yeah, so I am Anna, known as the Urban Nanna or Nana Anna. I'm not actually a grandma, but I have for many years now sort of been really trying to teach people traditional methods of doing things and crafts and skills that, typically or historically nanas and nonnos and, aunties and uncles and parents would do around the kitchen table, learning how to make a slow cooked stew and being frugal with your food and pickling and preserving or gardening, sewing, mending, all that kind of stuff were very typically kind of nana skills.
Yeah.
And I've wanted to do that for a really long time, just because it makes me feel grounded and settled, and I love it. But also in this age of, digital excess where we've got everything at our disposal, it's actually become overwhelming. And if you're lacking in the critical literacy to know which pickling or preserving recipe to use, you don't necessarily feel safe doing it. So I'm sort of wanting to create more of that guide beside feeling of learning, teaching and learning. That works really well. So I come from a teaching background. I was a teacher and vice principal at a primary school, which was very sustainably based, and that sort of spearheaded a lot of my permaculture training. And then, when I left teaching, I just furthered that, and now I teach council groups and library sessions all around Australia, and that's fantastic because it means it's free at the user end, so everyone can access that information for free, but I still get to make a livable wage by doing that. So I'm just like, yeah, it's a sweet spot. So I'm loving it.
And so were you brought up with those skills, or is it something you learnt in other areas of your life?
Yeah, so my mum is Swedish, and I was born in Denmark, and we moved here when I was about 3.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, so in the Scandinavian culture, there's this sort of underpinning belief of lagom living, which it's Swedish, and it means essentially take the middle road. You never need to be too excessive in anything. And, we moderate the resources we use. It connects us a lot to nature. Lots and lots of nature in Sweden, lakes, rivers, forests and stuff. So foraging is a huge thing, and so is preserving. And handcrafts are really sort of valued in those cultures. And my mum's an artist, and so she really had this kind of creative thing. So I definitely learnt a lot of, needlecraft skills and mending and all that kind of stuff from her. And then my dad's a scientist. So from him, I developed this. From him, I learnt, this love of, fact finding and pattern recognition and, how systems work and stuff like that. So I think in my household, we've always had the belief that nothing's an unsolvable problem. Everything's fixable. We might just not know the answer to it yet. So I think that, coupled with being autistic, if I want to learn about something, I now realise I will learn everything about it. And then info dump it on anyone who'll stand still for 5 minutes, But I think all those things together have kind of meant that, it wasn't classified as permaculture, but once I sort of discovered this framework of permaculture, I looked at it, I'm like, oh, that's all so familiar and just makes so much sense, So it just really easily translated into that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm a teacher too, actually. I did early childhood teaching.
Yep.
And one thing I loved when I was teaching at university, how a lot of the Scandinavian countries have the saying that there's no such thing as bad weather, just inappropriate dressing.
Yes.
And there's photos of children, which just blew my mind at the time, of these children out, they're playing in forest schools or even just at a preschool, and they're sleeping outside when it's snowing in bassinets, and they're all just rugged up, and the other kids are all playing and the other ones are just sleeping in these outside bassinets when it's snowing. And it's we are so not resilient in Australia. It gets below a certain temperature and we're it's freezing.
I know.
You can't go outside when it's raining, and we have this beautiful country.
Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, there's also because that is such a cultural norm, that is now built into the structural elements of Swedish life as well, and Danish life. Your houses are built with a drying room, so you've got the space to dry all of the soggy clothes that are soggy every day for 6 months of the year. If you try to do that in most typical Australian homes, you'd be struggling because where do you put all the stuff. So
Yeah,
I think,
true.
the design elements, they've kind of co-evolved, and that definitely makes it much more possible. So
Yeah.
retrofitting stuff, we just need to find what works for us.
Yeah,
But yeah, I
so
love the idea of just get the kids outside, just send them
yeah.
outside to play.
And so when you started learning about permaculture, how did you come across it? Was it through your teaching experience
Yeah.
or?
Yeah, it was, the school I taught at was a 5-star sustainable accredited school.
Oh, cool.
And one of the parent helpers actually came and did the Introduction to Permaculture course at Series, and
Ah,
would sort of bring back the information. And, she was saying, look, you're doing all this stuff around sustainability. I
yeah.
think you'd like permaculture because it's very much all of this. And well, you know what it's like being a
Yeah.
teacher. I didn't have the bandwidth to take anything
Yeah.
new in, so I was sort of just doing that thing. But when I came out of teaching a bit burnt out, I was sort of like, that really sounded like a good thing. I'm going to go have a look at that. And so I then went and did the Introduction to Permaculture
Yeah,
course at
cool.
Series as well. And then,
Yeah.
just like we said, deep diving,
Yeah.
hyperfixation. But yeah, the pattern finding stuff in permaculture just makes my heart sing, and it makes me feel so
Yeah.
much more grounded.
Yeah.
So I think once I found out what this kind of systems-based framework was, I was like, right, that's it. That's me done for
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
life. I'll just do this now.
That's so cool. And so, how do you find the balance of the old ways and traditional ways of doing things with the realities of our modern urban life? Because it's quite a dichotomy at for some people.
It really is. And one of the things I sort of speak about quite a lot in, community settings is,
Mm.
It's quite difficult, and it's very difficult, I would say, to break free from the mold of what we've been brought up with. We live in a capitalist, consumerist society, and we're indoctrinated from the day we're born, with all of our lovely matching baby clothes and bassinet, covers and all of the lovely things.
Yeah.
We are literally brought up with this identity as a consumer. That's that's what we're brought up with. And so we have this thing where you go to school so you can get an education, so you can get a job, so you can pay for all of the things, because that's what life is.
Yeah.
So if you're suddenly turning around to adults particularly and saying that's, well, you don't have to buy the stuff, and they're like, oh, so but isn't it only the people who make clothes who can make clothes? And isn't it, I didn't think we were allowed to pickle. I thought it was dangerous. And
Yeah.
it's a challenging thing to step free from what you've always known. So what I want to do with Everyday Permaculture and with the Urban Nanna is to not gloss over that fact, because it's like if you are teaching kids, if you ignore a really obvious fact about the classroom smells funny, then if you try to
Yeah.
ignore it completely, the kids aren't going to be paying attention to you, because they're like, well, she doesn't know the classroom smells funny, how much do I trust her?
Yeah.
So leaning into that and actually showcasing what can be possible. You don't need a composting toilet and a goat to do permaculture. You can do it in a townhouse or a 1-bedroom apartment in the middle of the city.
Yeah.
It's just going to look really different. And I think what I love about the framework of permaculture is that even if you own land, even if you own a homestead, or you're part of an intentional community, it still is going to look different for you. So it's kind of like evening out the playing field for everyone. It's saying it actually doesn't matter where you are, because this system by nature is adaptable, and therefore, maybe throw out all those ideas of the massive veggie patch, of the composting toilet, and just go, what does my system look like? What can I do within that is just even one step closer to sustainable living?
Yeah, I loved your book. So I got it just before Easter, and I probably got halfway through it before my mum stole it from me,
Oh,
and
no.
she started reading it. But I love it because it really dispels that kind of myth, I guess, that permaculture is a gardening practice, because that's so common
So
in
pervasive.
rhetoric. Yes.
Yeah.
And even the other day I interviewed someone, and because I don't just interview people who do permaculture, practice permaculture. I interview people that, are homesteaders or, into organic gardening, all kinds of things. And so I asked them if they, had any permaculture practices, and they said, oh, all those gardening techniques that Bill Mollison talk about, they're not really. And I'm just like, but it's not that.
It's not just
it's
that,
so
no.
frustrating. Yeah. And your book is so accessible and easy. And like, that's why we do this podcast, because I feel like there's so many high level permaculture podcasts that if you're just getting into it, it's really overwhelming and really hard. And your book is not like that at all. It is so grounded in the everyday. It's for all kinds of people. It's from a renter's perspective where you don't have to have home ownership. You don't have to have a garden. And so I just feel like it's this missing link and gap that people, Milkwood, they do a great job, but a lot of it's still garden focused, and people just don't know how to get into that unless it's gardening. Do you know what I mean? It's so
look,
prevalent.
and I'm really pleased to hear that, because that is, essentially what I wanted to do. It's, it's that bridging gap between all these amazing permaculturists who,
it's so cool.
And they didn't get to where they are by just doing the homestead stuff. They started smaller and they built up, but the expertise they have to share now is so steeped in what they're living at the moment that they want to share that, which, I think is fantastic.
And there's a need for it too. There's people who are at that level, but I just feel like there is a gap. Like, so those people are just tipping their toes in.
Yeah. So I wanted to just create as you said, a bridging solution. Because if you go to the property tour at Miliadora, they hold them once a month, where David Holmgren lives. It's a brilliant way of, seeing what it can look like in a garden space or in a home space. And I find that's much more accessible than reading through some of the bigger textbooks as someone who doesn't own property. But not everyone knows that you can do that. And, it can still feel daunting to look at it and go, I don't know how I get from my 1-bedroom apartment to this. And the reality is we've got up to 35% it's very close to 35% of Australian adults are now renting. And that number will increase if we get enough housing. But the reality is our housing situation is pretty dire at the moment. And it's not just talking about people who are unhoused or, people who are having to share spaces. It's stuff like, I'm between houses at the moment and I'm relying on the goodwill of friends and family. I will never be houseless because I've got community around me. So I feel incredibly privileged with that. But it is still a fact that I'm not gardening at the moment. I'm not, preserving at the moment because I'm in other people's spaces. So I need to then adapt. And it's kind of like that idea that your life goes through seasons for different reasons and you learn something from each of them. I'm naming this my composting era. There's a lot of shit going in and some good stuff will come out of it, but it just needs to sit and cook and then rest for a while.
And it's hard because we're working within the system framework. We are very lucky. We've had the opportunity to purchase some land. We've got 1.5 acres. But securing the funding to build on this land is nearly impossible. We had pre-approval and then the contractors are meant to start next week and they've turned around and said, oh, nope, sorry, actually we've changed our mind.
Oh, that's so hard. I'm sorry.
How do we overcome these barriers? And I had a conversation with Sue Dennett a couple of weeks ago about, how can we transition or how can we move towards, these goals that we might have of not necessarily owning land, but being on some more space or land or getting out of a city if that's what we want to be doing. And it's just, not a lot of people don't want to home share or property share. It's not possible for them with their brain or their abilities or, their body. And so it can be a real hard thing to kind of navigate.
Yeah, and it's, I'm in that position. People say, oh, why don't you just rent share with someone else? And I did that for a really long time. But what I now know about myself being autistic is that I run out of spoons quite quickly when I am doing teaching and when I'm trying to uphold all of the, the beliefs and principles that I want to, do in my life. So living in a space with someone else adds multitudinous elements to that. make it much harder for me to sort of carry out my everyday. So, this year it's really challenging. I'm running on chronically low spoons, and it means that it's much harder for me to kind of, take the next step in my permaculture journey.
You little cat.
Yeah, she's a little bit. She's arguably more popular than I am on social media.
What's her name?
Little bit.
Oh, that's her name. That's so cute.
But it's, I think, recognizing what your challenges and limitations are when it comes to personal energy is so important. But it's, again, not something that we are taught to do, because, if you get sort of big thinky about it, the system doesn't want you to not be productive. It wants you always to be productive, because that's what keeps the machine going. So for us to sort of, be honest with ourselves and say, I actually don't have capacity for this right now, is it feels very vulnerable, but it's also a really powerful step to take, because it allows you to go, okay, well, with the energy that I do have left, how can I budget that out so that I don't end up in burnout, and so that I do, at least get to feel good about myself and my actions in the everyday. I think I'm waffling a bit, but I'm just sort of like this idea that we've played this enforced role of consumers and parts in a bigger system that actually doesn't necessarily serve us in the best way as humans. Our society is so divided, and we're starting to get people who are like, oh, okay, well, it's all a bit rotten, and climate change is happening, the climate crisis is here, the weather's going to go bad. People have all these different beliefs about how the world's going to fall down. And then we get preppers who are like trying to be self-sufficient, and all that breeds is more division and, a false sense of resource scarcity. It's community sufficiency is the way forward. And I think, when you're talking about the living situations and whether you're house sharing, or, whether you're in a intentional community or not, that's fantastic for the people who can do it. But for the people who still rely on their wage, doing their everyday run-of-the-mill job, whether it's a corporate or an office or a retail job, we need those people, and they generally rely on being in suburban areas where we're getting less and less space and less capacity to do those things. So what I kind of see as a way forward is actually looking back to that kind of village concept. You had people within your closer village who would specialize in certain things that served the whole group. So, you had the beekeeper, you had the bread, the person who ran the bread oven, you had, the leather worker and the ironmonger and all that sort of stuff. And then, that kind of, you saw it a lot in Europe, where when housing density started to increase, people still had this drive to grow their own food, but they were like, well, we don't have the space to do it. So that's where we saw the rising of allotment farms, or, community gardens, as we call them in Australia. And I think that is a really great way to take a creative kind of encouraging step towards permaculture. I know it's bringing it back to gardening, and that's definitely not all there is to it. But if you want to break into more sustainable food systems, then getting into a community garden plot, or even just asking a neighbour or a friend if you can have a small garden bed in their garden space. The reason I think that gardening appeals to so many people when they're trying to live more sustainably is because gardening is circling around things that grow. And when you feel hopeless, looking towards things that grow gives you a sense of grounding, and it gives you a sense of purpose, and it also gives you a sense of hope. So gardens grow, but so does knowledge, and so do skills, and so do communities. So I was asked last week, where do I find hope? And I said, I just look to the things that grow, and you will always find something that's growing, whether it's your confidence or, love or relationships. I think it's a really powerful way to step away from that role we've been assigned within the consumerist society, and then by doing that, you find the support that you need and encouragement and inspiration to then find out what's your next step.
Yeah. And I think gardening's so empowering because it's, people realised how bad our food security is, a few years ago, and even now when we're getting floods and, weather events. And so I think gardening is so empowering because it's like a big FU to the system that, look, I can do it on my own kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it's also that pulling of the thread, you get in the rabbit hole and you might get into permaculture because, you've had a health crisis. And so, you've found permaculture, and then you realize that eating better is better for you. And how do you eat better? Well, you can grow it yourself. And so I think all roads inevitably do lead back to food security and gardening because it's such a need that we have, obviously, day to day to sustain ourselves. But
I mean, everyone has to eat. And that's, that's why in Everyday Permaculture, there's a massive chapter on food and then there's a chapter on foraging. And together they actually take up half of the book because everyone's got to eat and we've got to do it every day. Like, and I always sort of say to people in groups because, when I give presentations, jam-packed full of information, and at about the 2/3 mark, I can see people's faces just start to go, oh, I can't do all of this. And I sort of say, okay, instead of thinking, oh my God, there's too much stuff, I can never do all of this and therefore I'll never be sustainable and woe is me. What you can do is flip that on its head and say, oh, wow, cool. There's so many things that I could do. I'm definitely going to find at least one thing I can do well in here.
Yeah.
So, and, that idea about food is, there is going to be food happening most days. For most of us, we're privileged enough in Australia to say that. And I like to always say as well, though, when you are starting to make changes and you're trying to, make stuff from scratch or preserve things or, look after your food waste by some scraptastic cooking, it doesn't have to be perfect. No one's coming to your house with a clipboard to judge how good that meal is at your house. And I think in a culture where we've got Master Chef and we've got, My Kitchen Rules, I think we kind of all have in the back of our head, oh my gosh, you have to do wonderful food because you can. I mean, we've got truffle fries at McDonald's, for God's sake. Like, it's obscene. It's all synthetic truffle, but, it's true. Like, you don't, it's just a meal. Each meal is just a meal. It is a source of nutrients for your body. We're probably lucky enough for most of us to say, I will have another meal within the next 12 to 24 hours.
Yeah.
And can you remember all the bad meals you've had?
I know, right? Yeah.
So, I feel like that's an encouragement as well to just go, you can fuck it up. Like, you can get it wrong. You can make an awful tasting meal. Yeah. And if it genuinely is inedible, then you could just have a bit of toast. Like, it's there'll be another meal tomorrow. So I think that when it comes to changing your relationship with food and breaking up with the food system that exists, which is deeply flawed and hugely curated, that's where gardening comes in because it makes you more conscious of what the seasonal abundance is about, and it makes you taste your food and go, oh my God, is this what a tomato is supposed to taste like? Oh, well, I'm never buying those from the supermarket again. Like, it helps you make those life decisions much more firmly. Yeah.
And eating seasonally, like, that costs a lot less. So, that's a massive factor.
Yeah. And the nutrients are better for your body as well. Totally. So it just, but I mean, you can't necessarily go in with those arguments and convince someone who relies on supermarkets, fast, ready, available food. Yeah. But it is a cool thing that once you start, as you say, pulling that thread and unraveling, systemic beliefs, then you can go, oh yeah, and it tastes better, and it's cheaper, and it's more available, and it's better for you. Yeah.
If we're talking about convenience as well, there's a lot of things like we don't get it here because we're kind of rural, but there's a lot of things like the farmer's pick and, food rescues that are readily available in the city, and it is easy because they deliver it to you and those kinds of things. And yeah, I agree. I think we've lost simplicity in food as well. I remember as a kid, I mean, it's a luxury now to have eggs, but, having eggs for dinner.
Yeah.
Like, what's wrong with having an omelette or eggs for dinner? Or like my son will regularly have porridge for dinner because he's burnt out, he's had enough of school, he's overstimulated. and it's still like a wholesome meal to just have some
Yep.
oats and a banana. And I'm like,
And
go for it, mate.
it's you know,
Like,
it's the same food, it's safe food, it's nourishing, it's all of the things.
yeah.
Yeah.
You have this expectation, I think, especially as mothers, like, all the
Yes.
vegetables and the pressure around food, and the fights that you have your kids around food. It's just too
Yep.
much. So I'm like, you
Yep.
know what, dinner's right off. You eat whatever you want for dinner, because you're getting the rest of your nutrition when you wake up and for lunch and in your lunchbox. And dinner will be what it'll be. We just go simple for dinner.
And it goes back to, newborn sort of thinking
Yeah.
of fed is best.
Yeah.
It's
Totally.
not more than that. And we are lucky enough to have ample supply in Australia of food. And author Hope Yaron, who wrote Lab Girl and a small book called The Story of More, which you would absolutely love. It's a very slim novel, but it's, talking about the climate crisis, how we got here and what our next steps are. She, so succinctly puts it. She's like, we don't have a supply problem. There is more than enough food on the planet for every single human being in existence to be well fed. Yes. We just have a distribution problem.
Totally.
That's all it is. And
I've heard that.
It's very reductive, but it's,
Yeah. It's so true, though. Like, the amount of food waste we have could feed, whole countries.
Yeah. And, what I loved seeing during COVID was the rising of, community sharing stands. So food is free and grow free, even the little free libraries and toy sharing stores and stuff like that. Yeah. And I had a little one outside the front of my house, the community corner, and it was actually because I had gone foraging not before lockdowns began. And I had about 20 odd kilos of apples, and then, lost the will to do anything creative when suddenly we weren't sure if I'd have a job or what, and I was just like, oh, this is too much. And so I just went, rather than them sitting on my dining table, reminding me every time I step into the house when it smells of apples that, oh, you're not doing enough and you might not have a job and, you might not have money, you should preserve food. I was just like, I'm going to share them. I just put them out in a basket and, left a little label saying, they're a bit sour, but they're great for cooking. And within 2 days, they were all gone.
So cool.
But what ended up happening with the community corner was that it just really drove home this idea that when you start giving and giving freely of your resources, and that's not just stuff or food, that's your time, your care, your knowledge and skills. If you can learn to share that freely, without necessarily an expectation that it will come back to you, what always happens is it comes back to you. Like it just, with that, just with those apples, the next week I came home and there was some lemon slice on my front porch. I still don't know who it was from. It was just like, thanks for the apples. Here's some lemon slice. And someone else left me a little chocolate bar. And I was just like, oh, that's really nice. I suddenly feel much more supported by a community that's around me that I don't even know who they are. But I feel safer now. So I feel like I've never felt more rich than I did once I got that into my head, that sharing resources as and when they are abundant and valuable almost allows me to store energy in other people. So it's like this idea of, if you've got excess food, rather than letting it become compost, which is still using it, but rather than leaving it in the fridge to go soggy, if you know you're not going to use it, give it to someone who will. And then not only do you feel good for sharing, but that person has got a yield that they didn't expect, so they feel great. And then you end up having kindness brought back to you. It might be from them, it might be from someone else. It just, the gifting economy really is a wonderful thing, and probably one of my favourite things to come out of learning about permaculture.
Yeah, and you intrinsically get something back from it. You feel good about doing it. So even if, let's say nothing did come back to you, the thing you got was that feeling of doing something for someone else. So it's still worth it,
Look, a yield of, pride in being part of a community, that's a valuable yield.
Totally.
Because, it just shapes your actions going forward. And I don't know anyone who started up a community-free sharing stand who hasn't over time learnt more things about themselves and about how they fit in with their society. It's a really powerful kind of thing.
You talk about community a lot in your book, community with a big C and a little c. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm not religious, although I do have a minor in theology. I did go
Random.
random, I know. It was all part of my teaching
Oh, yeah,
teaching
okay.
education.
Yeah.
But if people are familiar with the concept of religion, there is what's known as church with a small c and church with a large C.
Okay.
And it's like that high church, low church. And so in villages, that would be your low church was just the biggest house in your village, and the travelling pastor or rector would come to that place and they would deliver a sermon there. And that was your kind of day-to-day connection with religion. And then you might, on high days and holidays, so Easter, Christmas, those sorts of things, you would
Yeah.
travel to the big cathedral, and they would have all the fancy systems set up around it, and the fancy clothes and all that sort of stuff, and everyone kind of went there with a sense of real deep reverence and whatever, and that was church with a capital C. So for me, community with a small c and a large C is somewhat similar. So communities are like the smaller groups that we're part of. With a small c, it is your football club or your mum's group from school, or your workmates that you hang out with. They are smaller groups that you interact with around a certain topic that you communally enjoy, and you enjoy spending time with each other around that kind of topic. Community with a big C for me, though, is what I was just explaining about, the food is free sharing stand. It's kind of like this broader sense or a knowledge that there are people around you in your local area, in your state, in your country, even around the globe. When we talk about the connections with social media,
Yeah.
it is this sense that there are so many people out there who have the same drive as you and the same ultimate goal as you. I mean, we've just had the election recently, and you could almost argue that people who vote Labor and people who vote Liberal, they have big C communities around them, because they know that there are other Australians who vote the same way, and therefore kind of have the same beliefs and the same understandings and the same goals.
Yeah.
So for me, community with a big C when it comes to permaculture is knowing that there are kids out there who are doing Clean Up Australia or tree planting day, or that, someone I saw in the local paper started up a petition to stop rat sacks so the owls don't die.
Yeah.
I will probably never meet many of the people who have done those things, but I know that they're out there and that they're doing their bit. So I don't have to do it all, because there are more people who are, it's like we're this big crew that's all working towards the same goal of living a bit more sustainably and not fucking up the planet, more than it already is.
Yeah.
And I almost give myself goosebumps when I talk about this, because it is the support that we need. Again, in that consumerist society where we are told that we are one person who has to earn a wage so we can afford our life, to feel like you are just one of many. And when you have a dip, others will be able to rise up. Brenna Quinlan has some wonderful illustrations about this sort of stuff. You can't always do it all, but if you are part of community sufficiency and big community groups, then you can have your down periods, because there'll always be someone else to rise up. So it's a bit like a seesaw within it, and then collectively we have so much power to make consistent forward change.
Yeah.
It's big thinking, but I think most people kind of get it when they think about it, themselves, or see it in action. They're just like, oh, that feels good. Yeah, no, I bought the sausage from Bunnings because it was the RSPCA and I care about animals, so I supported them. And your $2.50 goes a long way. So
yeah. And I think it gives you that permission slip, like you said, to just kind of, not have to do it all. And there is so much pressure, especially like you were saying earlier, with this digital age where you see everybody doing everything, or it appears that way, or you feel like you have to do it all or nothing. There's this, I get really caught up on composting because the way we've got our property, our composting bays are where it's going to suit when the house is eventually built, but it's kind of not in a very ideal situation right now, and it's muddy because it's rained for 8 weeks. And I can get really hard on myself for being like, oh, you didn't take the compost out, or you chucked that
banana skin in the bin, or, whatever it is that I didn't do, or and so it can be really hard when you have these expectations of yourself, but you also have to balance everything else in your life. It can be very overwhelming for people.
Absolutely. And look, one of the things I found really helpful recently is, when I buy salad in a bag, because yes, I do buy salad in a bag sometimes. The last week I've had 5 events, and the Urban Nanna is me. I'm it. I'm marketing, I'm sales, I'm admin, I'm everything. So adding to that my other life stuff going on, if I want to be healthy enough to get out and do podcast recordings and teach classes and workshops and write articles that get into mainstream media, I have to eat healthy food. However, when I'm so low on spoons, the thought of chopping up multiple ingredients to make a salad, I'm just going to choose a bit of toast or some pasta or something that will fuel the adrenaline and cortisol that, my body is using up, but isn't ultimately healthy for me. So it's kind of like kicking the can down the road. I will fall into a bigger heap if I don't eat healthy. So every now and then, when I've got multiple back-to-back events, I will buy a bag of salad in plastic. And rather than feel really heavy on myself, it's that whole leaning into your eco guilt is one thing that I also encourage, because the more guilty you feel about doing something that's unsustainable, the more likely it is that you are going to change it, and then it'll really stick. But when I start to feel bad about stuff, I now have the comparison of, whatever it was last month. At least I'm not a woman who went up for an 11-minute trip into space, burning more carbon emissions.
Thank the Lord for Katy Perry. She makes us feel so much better about ourselves.
I'm just like, oh, okay. And because I think being environmentally conscientious goes hand in hand with, living a more permaculture aligned life. It can be really hard to really see what a lot of the world is doing when we feel down about something, and then we beat ourselves up. But the reality is, if we don't compare ourselves to, 85% of the population every now and then, we're going to burn out, and then even the good stuff we're doing doesn't happen. So I think it's kind of like a dip in and out kind of situation. And look, I wrote Everyday Permaculture as I do most of my teaching, which is kind of pitching at a grade 3-4 level, which assumes that the students have got knowledge and they've got real life experience knowledge, and they're smart. They know how to piece things together. Because humans are smart, but when we've been told we're meant to be one thing for all of our lives, it's really hard to break free from that. So I want people to go, okay, I could just do little things. It's just like activities in grade 3. Yeah, cool. There's workstations. I can go and do a few different workstations, and I can't do them all at once. So I'll learn them, and I'm just practicing. I'm getting better at all of them over time. But it also reminds me that you cannot be angry at students who are 8 and 9 years old for not having learned something yet. You can't go in with anger and visible frustration, because that actually just shuts off that ability to then learn and do more, or desire to do any more. So when it comes to, treating yourself when you are learning new skills and practices, if you get too angry at yourself, you're actually going to cut off that desire to do anything different going forward. So just give yourself a bit of grace. I use that quite a lot when Captain Anxiety, I've actually named, and I have a whole avatar for my anxiety. Captain Anxiety.
I heard you talk about it on the podcast with Katie. That was really cool. I love it.
Because he's like, when I'm busy, he can sometimes creep out of his stateroom on the ship and he can steer us towards the rocks. So, but I know that getting angry at him isn't going to help, because he's just this old doddery, alcoholic sea captain, and he won't remember it anyway. So I'm just like, all right, he's only doing it because he's feeling a bit lost and a bit scared. So, all right, if your anxiety comes in, embrace it and go, you are a part of me, and you're a signal that there's something going on that I'm not comfortable or not feeling good about. I'm going to treat it with gentleness, tell it doesn't have to worry, send Captain Anxiety back to his room with a bottle of rum and just say, you just sit there, mate. We've got this. We will, we'll steer the ship. We're all good. But no, you used to do a wonderful job. You served me really well. I just don't need you right now. So I kind of think that when I feel anxious or guilty about something as well.
And I think there's a big difference between guilt and shame.
Yes.
You feel guilty about something because intrinsically it's not right, for yelling at your kid or for pushing it in line or like whatever it is.
Yeah.
But shame is very societal driven on the expectations and the shoulds that you think you should be doing, but it's not actually your belief system, or it's not something that actually matters to you. And so recognizing the difference and going, am I doing this because I should be? And do I feel guilty about giving my son porridge at night because he should be having vegetables or he should be having more protein? Or do I feel guilty for another reason?
Yeah, or is it actually shame? Yeah,
exactly. Is it shame because I've seen all these amazing mums doing all these amazing, things on Instagram
cutouts
with their
for
children.
Sandwiches.
Exactly. Bento boxes and whatnot.
Which are great, which are lovely, but
great, good on you, but not for me, not right
now. Not
now.
always, yeah.
And so differentiating between that guilt and shame, I think it can be really valuable to know where that's coming from.
Yeah, and look, I talk about it in the book that guilt is something that we are evolutionarily hardwired to avoid feeling, because guilt, as you said, it sort of ties into what we know we should be doing for the betterment of our tribe. And, that was that sort of Australopithecus and cavemen type concept, was you had a small tribe. And if you didn't all look out for each other and do what was necessary to survive, thrive, and reproduce, then you would be kicked out of the tribe. Like,
that's
because if you're not pulling your weight, then why would they keep you there? So guilt was kind of this feeling that, psychologically evolved from this, like, I've not done the thing that keeps me in connection and keeps me, in steady flow with my group, with my tribe. So I better do that. Otherwise, I'm at risk of being ousted, and therefore I can't survive, thrive, and reproduce, which is the purpose of every living thing on the planet. End of. Words just get in the way. So that guilt is hardwired in us to help keep us in line with what, what is the best thing to do. Having said that, though, over time, society does shape what we intrinsically feel guilty about. That's a whole thesis in and of itself. So for me, when it comes to eco guilt, I just say, look, clock it every time it happens. So, every time you buy tiny teddies with the 6 individual packets inside the big packet, feel guilty about it, but don't let it completely run you down. Log the feeling. And then if you log it enough, something will click in your head and you'll be like, do you know what? I am sick of feeling guilty about this. I don't want to do it. And then you'll never buy tiny teddies with the 6 individual wrappers inside it again, because it's such a deep decision of your own, rather than someone telling you you shouldn't buy plastic things. And then you feel a bit like, but they won't know anyway. Do you know what I mean? It's like more of a self-propelling behavioural change if you come to it yourself.
So going back to living in small spaces or cities, what do you think are some quick wins or things that people can start to adopt if they are wanting to kind of move in this direction? Is there anything you recommend that's kind of easy, manageable, dip your toe in?
I think the biggest thing is around waste. So even though everyone says gardening is the biggest thing in permaculture, I maintain that waste in our current society is the biggest challenge for everyone. So if you can do a bit of an audit on your waste system, look at what's already happening. How much of a full bin do you put out every week? Are you recycling stuff? Are you consistently buying things in plastic wrap that could be bought without? If you audit that, you can then start to set up a waste management system that suits you. So in small apartment living, you might not have a worm farm or a compost heap, but you can use things. There are some online websites where you can actually it's almost like dating for composting.
Yeah, they're cool.
You can sort of say, hey, I've got this stuff. Who's local? Who wants more resources for their actual compost pile? So if you were living in an apartment, finding out where your local place that does composting is, and save your food scraps to give to them, or doing some more diverting food waste from being actual waste and saying, how else can I use these food scraps one more time before they actually become waste? So scraptastic cooking, using all your veggie scraps, they go into a container in the freezer. Once that's full, chuck it all into a big pot, fill it with water and let it simmer for a few hours, and then you've got veggie stock. The more you do that, the less reliant you are on UHT, which are largely unrecyclable in most systems in Australia. It is possible, but it's not great. If you make your own stock for a year, that's potentially 20 UHT containers or more that you haven't bought and added to the waste crisis. So food waste, diverting food from becoming waste, and to that end, learning to store food properly, or learning to ferment or dehydrate. One of my favourite things to do in summer and autumn is to use the dashboard of my car to dehydrate things.
I saw a photo of that. That is so cool. But what was your tip? Don't do certain things?
Don't do chili or garlic. I learnt that the hard way.
I would so do that and be like, oh, whoops.
Well, it's basically pepper spray. If you open the car after chili, I'm just like, I can't drive that car for now. I'm going to have to leave it to air out for a day.
So funny.
But, if you have mint left over, if you are still buying herbs in plastic from the supermarkets, then at very least don't let any of that mint go to waste or those herbs go to waste. Dehydrate them on top of your oven or overheating vent or in the dashboard of your car, and then you've got herbal tea. Do some rose petals, mint, and some apple slices. You can dehydrate apple in the microwave.
Oh, that's a clever idea. I never thought about that.
And then put the three of them together, and then you've essentially got Turkish Delight tea. It's delightful. And then you're not buying tea bags in microplastic, tea bag fibres and packaging and stuff like that. So I think look for the small wins when it comes to waste. And if you are, whether you're renting or whether you are homeowners, also doing an energy audit of your house and seeing where you're, potentially overusing expensive resources like electricity and gas. And, set and forget things like change the light globes to energy saving, change the shower head to water saving, stopping up cracks and stuff, using curtains and pelmets to keep warmth in winter. It's the everyday stuff. It sounds so simple and boring when you say it, and that's because it actually is, which is really kind of encouraging as well, because it's like, change the light. Well, I could do that. That's not hard. That's not changing my whole life system, So there's heaps of that sort of stuff in the book where it's too much, basically. It's too much so that it gives you a smorgasbord of ideas that you can try a couple of little things. And I love the way that Heidi Grant has the team I had. They put together the best team, the designer and the photographer and stylist and editor. They were just all, my editor recently had her house in the Sustainable Homes show, and she lives up in Kyneton, so we did all the editing, over the phone. And, Brenna being the illustrator, she's heavily into permaculture, and I just feel like the whole crew was really dedicated to getting this message out there in the most accessible, as you said, but also the most beautiful and sort of nurturing kind of way. So it has that guide beside feeling to it.
And I love all the little anecdotes that you have from different people and the QR codes for Charlie's music.
Yeah.
It's so nice.
Yeah, no, it's been a beautiful book to produce, a long process, especially with the foraging chapter. I was taking photographs 2 years ago for the foraging chapter because, of course, I had to capture every season. And, for interest's sake as well, this whole book, even the foraging chapter, including the ID guides, are all applicable to every country that the book is available in. So Australia, New Zealand, UK, Ireland, US and Canada. It's just as applicable no matter where you live. It's not based on the Australian climate. Because, the permaculture thinking is not new. Even the way Bill and David put it together, it was very heavily pulling on so many different cultural, traditional things from multiple cultures around the world.
Yeah.
And it'll evolve and it'll grow better over time. But it is always going to be centered around where you are and what you've got available to you. You know, it's going to live on as a framework based on the societies that it sort of exists in. That's why we see it looking different in South America and in America and, you know, in Asia to Australia.
Yeah. And that's what I love about permaculture. There are no rules. It's just a framework, and you use it based on your context and what you have available at your disposal, and you don't have to do it all. Slow and simple solutions and taking it one step at a time. But it can be hard because you have to unlearn so much.
I would actually argue that the unlearning is probably the biggest barrier. And that's where I think that idea, like you say, small and slow solutions, I say to people, pick one thing.
Yeah.
Just like literally one.
Yeah.
And give yourself double the amount of time that you think it'll take you to do it. And then keep doing it. Don't pick another one yet. Just keep doing that thing until you get so good at it that it's boring. That means it's part of your everyday now. Then pick your next one.
That's my biggest downfall. I just want it all to do it all.
Yeah.
And
that's,
you know,
that's because that's how we've been brought up. Yeah.
Totally. And still unlearning.
Yeah, exactly. But no, it's to have podcasts like this one where you are pulling together all these different voices and, you know, allowing people to see all these other ways of doing permaculture is so incredibly helpful because, you know, if book reading and, you know, paying to go on courses isn't a thing that's available to you, auditory learning, like, you know, the different multidisciplinary stuff is so valuable. So, thank you very much for putting all the effort you do into podcasts because it's a lot of work and, it's very much appreciated by many, many people.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm so happy I got a chance to chat with you. I could probably talk to you for the hour. There's so many questions I had written down that I didn't even touch on, but that's fine.
I do love a good waffle, so...
And if anybody wants to access some of your workshops, do you mainly put them on your website? Or,
yes. So I do send out a newsletter once a month, which just says, hey, here are all the free activities I've got coming up the next month. So if people want to subscribe to the website, that's the only email you'll get from me unless I write another article, which probably isn't going to happen this year. So it's not a spammy kind of thing. It literally is just to show you what's available. But there is an events page on the website as well where everything's listed. And keep an eye out. There are excerpts at the moment in ABC Organic Gardener, New Idea, Woman's Day, and there's going to be one in Woman's Weekly soon as well. So we're really kind of getting out there, getting the message into mainstream media, which is awesome.
That's amazing. Yes. And I'll put a link for anybody who wants to buy your book because I highly, highly recommend it. I bought it at my... Yes.
Hello.
So good. I got up to... Where did I get up to before my mum took it off me? I got up to the food chapter.
Oh, so you've got foraging to go yet. Oh, you'll love it. It's great.
Maybe I did get up to foraging. But the pictures, like, they're just so gorgeous. For
I know, and I maintain you can never have too many glass jars or too many baskets. So it's actually now selection criteria for my rentals is, does this have space for my jar?
And there's, like I said, little excerpts from, like, different people and their kind of thoughts and... the little QR codes for Charlie McGee's music. And, I mean, look at that. Brenda is so talented. Like,
I know. It's just beautiful.
So
lovely. So it's...
As highly I said, recommend.
The team at Hardy Grant did an amazing job. And, it's out there in all independent bookshops. Or if it's not, just ask them and then the reps will get it out there, but obviously online and stuff as well. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been really delightful.
Amazing. All right, I'll put all those links in the show notes for anybody who wants them. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks. Bye.